The hospital room was almost silent when Jungkook finally arrived, carrying a small gift he had guarded carefully against the rain. He had imagined Jimin smile the moment he saw it. But instead, the second Jimin looked inside the box, his expression completely changed. His eyes filled with tears, his hands began to tremble, and for a moment, he could not even look at Jungkook. Something inside that gift had reopened a wound Jimin had desperately tried to bury. Jungkook had no idea why Jimin was crying. And he certainly wasn't prepared for the truth behind those tears. Before the hospital room became the place where everything between them would change, Jimin and Jungkook had shared a bond that seemed almost impossible to break. They had spent years learning each other without needing explanations, recognizing exhaustion in a single glance, sadness behind a forced smile, and fear hidden beneath moments of silence. To everyone around them, their connection appeared effortless. But behind that closeness were countless memories that only they understood, small promises that had never been spoken aloud, and sacrifices neither of them had ever admitted making. Jimin had always been the one who noticed when Jungkook was pushing himself too hard. He could sense the difference between Jungkook's genuine smile and the smile he used when he wanted everyone to believe he was fine. Jungkook, in return, had developed an almost instinctive habit of watching over Jimin. Whenever Jimin became quiet, Jungkook would find a reason to stay nearby. Whenever Jimin seemed overwhelmed, Jungkook would quietly make space for him. Neither of them considered these things extraordinary. They had simply become part of the rhythm of their lives. But recently, that rhythm had begun to change. The first signs were so subtle that even Jimin almost convinced himself they were nothing. Jungkook started disappearing after rehearsals without explanation. He stopped answering messages as quickly as before. Sometimes he would arrive looking exhausted, yet somehow determined to hide it. Jimin noticed the shadows beneath his eyes and the tension in his shoulders, but whenever he tried to understand what was happening, Jungkook seemed to become more distant. What Jimin did not know was that Jungkook had been carrying something alone. For weeks, he had been preparing a surprise for Jimin. It was not expensive, glamorous, or meant to impress anyone. It was something deeply personal, connected to a memory from years earlier, when Jimin had quietly helped Jungkook through one of the most difficult periods of his life. Jungkook had never forgotten that moment. He had kept one small reminder of it hidden for years, believing that one day he would return the meaning behind that gesture. That day seemed to arrive when Jimin suddenly became ill. The news spread quickly through the group, and the atmosphere changed almost instantly. RM became more cautious, Jin tried to keep everyone calm, Sugar watched the situation with quiet concern, and J-Hope struggled to hide how worried he was. Taehyung remained especially close, checking on Jimin whenever he could. Yet among all of them, Jungkook seemed to react differently. He became almost painfully silent. Rather than staying at the hospital constantly, Jungkook began leaving for short periods. Each time he returned, there was something different in his expression. His face carried exhaustion, but also determination. It was as if he was racing against time to finish something before Jimin discovered it. Jimin noticed. From his hospital bed, surrounded by unfamiliar sounds and dim evening light, he began wondering why the person he trusted most seemed to be avoiding him. Every time Jungkook entered the room, Jimin felt a strange mixture of comfort and anxiety. Jungkook would remain nearby for a while, quietly watching him, then leave again before Jimin could understand what was happening. The distance hurt more than Jimin wanted to admit. He began questioning memories that should have felt safe. He wondered whether he had done something wrong. Perhaps Jungkook was tired of constantly worrying about him. Perhaps their friendship had slowly changed, and Jimin was simply the last person to realize it. Those thoughts became heavier at night. When the hospital corridor grew quiet and the lights outside his room dimmed, Jimin would stare toward the empty chair beside his bed. That chair had become strangely important. It represented all the moments when Jungkook had been there before, sitting silently through difficult nights, making sure Jimin never felt alone. Now it was often empty. And the emptiness created a fear Jimin could not explain. One evening, Taehyung noticed the change in him. Jimin looked toward the door several times, almost expecting someone to appear. Taehyung could see the disappointment behind his expression, but he also sensed that something larger was happening. There were questions Jungkook clearly was not ready to answer, and there were emotions Jimin was trying desperately to suppress. Still, no one knew the entire truth. Not even Jimin. Meanwhile, several floors away, Jungkook was sitting alone with the small gift in his hands. He had spent days searching for the right way to give it to Jimin. He had changed the wrapping more than once. He had considered leaving it beside the hospital bed, then decided he needed to see Jimin's reaction himself. Inside the box was something that carried years of memories, something Jimin would recognize immediately. But Jungkook had not anticipated one thing. He had not realized that the same object he believed would bring Jimin comfort might also remind him of a painful secret. As the night deepened, Jungkook finally stood and looked at the gift one last time. His hands tightened around it as he remembered why he had chosen it. He had made a promise to himself long ago that he would never let Jimin feel alone when life became difficult. Yet somehow, in trying to protect him, Jungkook had created exactly the kind of distance he had once promised to prevent. And when he finally walked toward Jimin's hospital room, carrying the gift beneath his coat, he had no idea that within minutes, the carefully hidden truth between them would begin to unravel. The hallway outside Jimin's room was unusually quiet that night. The fluorescent lights cast pale reflections across the polished floor, while the distant sound of medical equipment seemed to echo through the empty corridor. Jungkook walked slowly, holding the small gift against his chest as though it contained something fragile enough to break if he loosened his grip. His footsteps were controlled, but his expression revealed the exhaustion he had been hiding for days. Inside the room, Jimin was awake. He had been staring at the ceiling for nearly an hour, unable to sleep. The silence gave his thoughts too much space, and every unanswered question seemed to grow heavier. He remembered Jungkook leaving earlier that evening without explanation. He remembered the hesitation in his eyes. He remembered the way he had looked at Jimin as if he wanted to say something important, but had decided against it. That memory hurt more than Jimin expected. Then the door opened. Jungkook stepped inside. For a moment, Jimin's heart lifted automatically. That reaction was so instinctive that it almost frightened him. No matter how distant Jungkook had seemed, one glance at him could still make Jimin feel safe. But that comfort disappeared when Jimin noticed the gift in Jungkook's hands. The box was small, carefully wrapped, and held with unusual tenderness. Jungkook placed it beside the bed but did not immediately give it to him. He simply stood there, looking at Jimin with an expression that seemed to contain too many emotions at once. Relief, fear, guilt, hope, and something much deeper that Jimin could not identify. Jimin watched him carefully. The silence between them became heavier. Instead of asking what was wrong, Jimin waited. He had learned that sometimes Jungkook needed time before revealing what was inside his heart. But tonight felt different. There was something final about the way Jungkook looked at him, as though this gift represented more than a simple gesture. Eventually, Jungkook pushed the box closer. Jimin hesitated before reaching for it. His fingers touched the wrapping paper, and an unfamiliar sense of anxiety immediately settled over him. The box seemed ordinary, but something about it felt strangely familiar. He slowly removed the wrapping, revealing a simple dark-colored case underneath. Jungkook's expression changed the moment Jimin saw it. Jimin opened the case. And everything inside him seemed to stop. The object resting there was connected to a memory he had spent years trying not to revisit. It was something from a period when their lives had been completely different, when their friendship had been younger, more fragile, and filled with promises neither of them fully understood. Jimin remembered it immediately, not because of its appearance, but because of what it represented. His eyes filled with tears. Jungkook froze. He had imagined many reactions. A smile. Surprise. Perhaps even laughter at the memory. He had never imagined tears. Jimin lowered his head, trying to hide his face. His shoulders trembled slightly, and the effort to remain composed only made the emotion more obvious. The gift had brought back something he had buried. A promise. A night. And a moment Jimin had believed Jungkook had forgotten. The realization struck Jungkook with terrifying force. He had thought he was returning something precious. Instead, he had reopened a wound. Jimin slowly touched the object again, his fingertips trembling. The memory became clearer with every second. He remembered the place where they had been. He remembered Jungkook's expression back then. Most painfully, he remembered what had happened afterward. For years, Jimin had believed that Jungkook had walked away from that promise. He had never understood why. Now the same object was sitting in his hands. That should have meant Jungkook had remembered everything. But if Jungkook remembered, then why had he spent so much time avoiding him? That question cut through Jimin's emotions. The tears continued falling, but they were no longer tears of simple sadness. They carried confusion, disappointment, and a painful sense of betrayal. Jungkook could see it happening. He had come to the hospital hoping to make Jimin feel loved. Instead, he was watching Jimin slowly become convinced that he had been forgotten. And before either of them could understand what had gone wrong, the door opened again. Taehyung stood outside. He had come to check on Jimin, but the moment he saw the two of them, he stopped. His eyes moved from Jimin's tearful face to the object in his hands. Something changed in Taehyung's expression. He recognized it. Not completely, but enough. Because Taehyung had seen that object before. Years ago. And suddenly, a memory Jungkook had carefully hidden began to surface. Taehyung remembered the day Jungkook had secretly asked for his help. He remembered Jungkook's desperation to protect Jimin from something he believed would destroy him emotionally. He remembered being told that Jimin could never know the real reason behind a certain decision. At the time, Taehyung had agreed to keep the secret. But now, standing in the hospital doorway, he realized that the secret might have caused more pain than the truth ever could. He stepped back without entering. For the first time, Taehyung understood why Jungkook had been acting strangely. But there was still one question he could not answer. Why had Jungkook waited all these years to return the gift? And more importantly, what exactly had he sacrificed to keep the promise? Inside the room, Jimin continued staring at the object through blurred eyes. He wanted an explanation. But somewhere deep inside, he was already afraid of what that explanation might reveal. Because sometimes the truth does not heal an old wound. Sometimes it proves that the wound was never truly closed. Taehyung remained outside the room for several seconds, unable to decide whether entering would help or only make the situation worse. Through the narrow opening of the door, he could see Jimin holding the gift with both hands, his eyes fixed on it as though he were trying to understand how something from the past had suddenly returned to his life. Jungkook stood a few steps away, motionless, carrying the expression of someone who had finally reached the moment he had feared for years. The secret he had protected so carefully was no longer safely hidden. It was sitting in Jimin's hands. Inside, Jimin's memories continued unfolding. He remembered a night from years earlier when everything between him and Jungkook had felt simpler. They had been younger, still learning how to understand the weight of promises and the consequences of choices made in moments of fear. Jimin remembered being exhausted that night, emotionally overwhelmed and uncertain about the future. Jungkook had stayed beside him longer than anyone else. There had been a small object involved, something Jimin had treated as meaningless at the time, but that Jungkook had treated as a symbol of something much larger. Jimin remembered giving it away. He remembered believing it would always remain with Jungkook. And he remembered the painful months that followed, when Jungkook suddenly became distant. At the time, Jimin had blamed himself. He had wondered whether he had become too dependent, whether his emotions had overwhelmed Jungkook, whether their friendship had reached a point where one of them needed to step away. He never received a clear explanation. Jungkook had simply become quieter, more guarded, and harder to reach. Jimin had eventually learned to accept the distance. Or at least, he had convinced himself that he had. Now the object had returned. That single fact shattered years of acceptance. Jungkook watched Jimin carefully, but the longer the silence continued, the more his own composure began to disappear. He had spent so much time imagining this moment that he had never imagined how helpless he would feel once it actually arrived. The truth was that the gift had never been meant to be returned simply because Jungkook wanted to give something back. He had kept it because he could not let go. For years, it had remained hidden among his most personal belongings. Whenever life became overwhelming, he would find himself looking at it again. It reminded him of the person Jimin had been during that difficult period, but more importantly, it reminded him of the promise Jungkook had made silently afterward. He had promised himself that Jimin would never have to carry the consequences of his decision. That promise had required sacrifice. And the sacrifice had begun long before Jimin ever entered the hospital. Jungkook had been protecting a secret involving someone else, a secret that had affected the way he treated Jimin without Jimin understanding why. Every time Jungkook pulled away, it had been because he believed distance would protect Jimin. Every unanswered message had been intentional. Every cancelled meeting had been part of a plan Jungkook thought was necessary. But protection built on silence had slowly become indistinguishable from rejection. Jimin had never known that. All he had seen was the distance. All he had felt was abandonment. That was the cruelest part. Jungkook had sacrificed closeness in order to protect Jimin, yet the loss of that closeness had become the very thing that hurt Jimin most. Outside the room, Taehyung lowered his gaze. He remembered the burden of keeping Jungkook's secret. At first, he had believed he was helping. He had believed that some truths were too painful to reveal, and that silence could sometimes be an act of love. But watching Jimin cry now made him question everything. There was a difference between protecting someone from pain and deciding that person was not strong enough to handle the truth. Taehyung had never considered that distinction before. And now it was impossible to ignore. He eventually walked away from the door, but he did not go far. He knew something was coming. Inside the room, Jimin wiped his tears and looked again at the gift. The object itself was not what hurt him most. It was the realization that Jungkook had kept it all this time. If Jungkook had truly forgotten him, he would have thrown it away. If their memories had meant nothing, he would never have preserved something so carefully. That created a new and more painful question. If Jungkook still cared so deeply, why had he allowed Jimin to believe otherwise? The answer seemed impossible. Jungkook had spent years imagining that one day he would explain everything. He had imagined doing it when the circumstances were safer, when Jimin was stronger, when the secret no longer had the power to damage anyone. But life had never waited for the perfect moment. Instead, Jimin had ended up in a hospital bed. And Jungkook had suddenly realized that waiting any longer might mean losing the opportunity forever. That was why he had brought the gift. Not as a simple present. As an apology he did not know how to speak. As proof that the past had never disappeared. As a final attempt to return something that had always belonged to Jimin. But the gift had created another problem. Jimin had begun connecting memories that Jungkook had hoped would remain separate. The first clue came from the date engraved on the inside of the case. Jimin stared at it for several seconds. His breathing changed. He recognized the date immediately. It was the same date as the night Jungkook had suddenly disappeared from his life for several weeks. The same night Jimin had spent wondering what he had done wrong. The same night he had cried alone because he believed Jungkook no longer wanted to be close to him. His fingers tightened around the case. For the first time, he understood that those events might not have been separate. They might have been connected all along. Jungkook saw the realization forming in Jimin's eyes. Fear crossed his face. Not fear of being blamed. Fear of Jimin finally understanding how much had been sacrificed behind the scenes. Because once Jimin discovered the entire truth, there would be no way to undo the years of misunderstanding. The next morning, the rest of the group began noticing that something was wrong. RM sensed the tension immediately. Jin became unusually quiet. Sugar watched Jungkook with an expression suggesting that he understood more than he was saying. J-Hope tried to maintain a normal atmosphere, but even he could feel the heaviness surrounding everyone. Taehyung finally returned to the room later that morning. He carried a burden he had avoided for years. He knew Jimin deserved answers. But he also knew that revealing everything could expose the sacrifice Jungkook had made in secret. The problem was that the secret was no longer protecting anyone. It was destroying the relationship it had been created to protect. Meanwhile, Jimin had barely slept. The gift remained beside him. Every time he looked at it, another memory surfaced. He remembered moments when Jungkook had seemed cold. Moments when Jimin had interpreted silence as rejection. Moments when Jungkook had walked away just as Jimin needed him most. For years, Jimin had collected those moments as evidence that their bond had changed. Now, one by one, those memories were beginning to look different. Maybe Jungkook had not walked away because he stopped caring. Maybe he had walked away because he cared too much. That possibility should have comforted Jimin. Instead, it made him angry. Because love without honesty had still caused pain. And sacrifice without explanation had still left scars. Jimin began wondering how many times Jungkook had watched him suffer while knowing the truth. How many times had Jungkook stood silently while Jimin blamed himself? How many nights had Jungkook chosen silence instead of telling him what was really happening? The questions became unbearable. Then another discovery changed everything. While searching through the small case, Jimin noticed something hidden beneath the lining. It was a folded piece of paper. His hands trembled as he pulled it out. The paper was old. The edges were worn. And the handwriting belonged to Jungkook. Jimin stared at it for several seconds before unfolding it. He expected an explanation. Instead, he found something that made his heart sink. It was not a confession. It was a promise written years ago. A promise that seemed impossible to understand without knowing what had happened afterward. Jimin read it again. Then again. His eyes filled with tears. Because the final line suggested something he had never considered. Jungkook had not abandoned him. He had deliberately made Jimin believe that he had. And if that was true, then everything Jimin thought he knew about their painful separation had been built on a lie. The realization left him devastated. Not because Jungkook had lied, but because Jimin suddenly understood that the lie had been created for a reason. And whatever that reason was, it had been serious enough for Jungkook to sacrifice their relationship rather than tell him the truth. At that moment, the door opened. Taehyung entered slowly. He looked at the paper in Jimin's hands. His expression changed immediately. He knew exactly what Jimin had found. For years, Taehyung had promised himself that he would never reveal the secret unless Jungkook chose to do it first. But now he saw the pain in Jimin's eyes. He realized the truth had already begun escaping. There was no way to stop it. And perhaps there had never been. Because the greatest misunderstanding between Jimin and Jungkook had never been about whether they cared about each other. It had always been about why one of them had chosen to disappear. And the answer was far more painful than either of them had imagined. The paper remained between Jimin's trembling fingers as Taehyung stood silently near the doorway. Neither of them moved for several seconds. The hospital room seemed to shrink around them, filled only with the quiet rhythm of the machines and the sound of Jimin trying to steady his breathing. He looked at Taehyung as though he already knew that the person standing before him had been carrying a piece of the truth for years. That realization hurt almost as much as the secret itself. Taehyung had always been someone Jimin trusted. That was why the discovery felt like another layer of betrayal. It was one thing to believe Jungkook had hidden something. It was another to realize that someone else had known and had chosen to remain silent while Jimin struggled to understand why his closest bond had suddenly changed. Yet Taehyung's expression contained no satisfaction, no defensiveness, and no attempt to escape responsibility. It contained regret. Deep regret. Jimin looked back at the old paper and noticed that several words had faded with time. The promise had been written during a period when Jungkook had been struggling with a decision that apparently affected more than just the two of them. There was no complete explanation, only fragments that hinted at a choice Jungkook had made because he believed Jimin's future would be safer without him being too close. That idea was almost unbearable. Jimin had spent years believing that he was the reason Jungkook had left. Now he was beginning to understand that Jungkook had left because he believed he was the reason Jimin might suffer. The difference was enormous. But the pain remained. Because neither of them had trusted Jimin enough to let him decide whether the sacrifice was necessary. That thought followed Jimin throughout the morning. He barely touched his food. He ignored the television playing quietly in the corner. Even when Jin and J-Hope came to visit, Jimin remained distant, his attention repeatedly returning to the small gift beside his bed. RM noticed immediately that something had changed, but he chose not to pressure him. Sugar stayed near the window, observing Jungkook whenever he appeared in the hallway. The group could feel the tension. Something had surfaced. Something old. Something powerful enough to make Jungkook look as though he had been carrying the weight of the entire past on his shoulders. Jungkook eventually returned to the hospital room. The moment he saw the paper in Jimin's hands, he stopped. His face lost its color. He understood immediately that the secret had reached its final stage. There was nowhere left to hide. Jimin watched him carefully. The anger inside him was confusing because it existed beside something much softer. He was angry that Jungkook had made decisions on his behalf. He was hurt that years of distance had been built around a secret he had never been allowed to understand. But beneath that anger was an undeniable realization that Jungkook had never stopped caring. That realization made forgiveness more complicated, not easier. Jungkook moved closer to the bed, but he stopped before reaching Jimin. For years, he had been afraid of this exact moment. He had imagined Jimin hating him. He had imagined Jimin refusing to believe the truth. He had even imagined Jimin deciding that their relationship had been a mistake. What he had not imagined was seeing Jimin cry, because the truth proved that Jungkook had loved him enough to destroy his own place in Jimin's life. Jimin looked down again. The old promise contained one detail he had completely forgotten. It referred to a night when Jimin had been at his most vulnerable, a night when Jungkook had made a decision without telling him. That decision had caused Jungkook to distance himself for weeks, and afterward, he had continued maintaining the distance even when it clearly hurt both of them. Jimin finally understood why. There had been someone watching them. Someone who had threatened to expose a private matter that could have created enormous pressure around Jimin. Jungkook had believed that if he appeared to be the one ending the closeness, attention would move away from Jimin. He had taken the blame intentionally. He had allowed Jimin to think he was cold. He had allowed himself to become the villain in Jimin's memory. And he had done it because he believed protecting Jimin mattered more than being understood by him. But the sacrifice had come with a devastating consequence. Jimin had spent years carrying the wrong guilt. He had believed he had failed Jungkook. He had believed he had been too emotional, too demanding, or too dependent. He had quietly changed parts of himself because he thought those things had pushed Jungkook away. That was the wound Jungkook had never seen. He had protected Jimin from one danger while unknowingly creating another. Jimin's self-doubt had grown in the space Jungkook left behind. The realization broke something inside Jungkook. He had spent years believing his sacrifice had worked. Now he understood that he had never truly saved Jimin from pain. He had simply transferred the pain into a different place. Taehyung eventually revealed the part he had been carrying.